Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Emily Huff, and I'm Editor-in-Chief of the Crisis Response Journal. I'm also a board member of the European Emergency Number Association, ENA 112. And I'm absolutely delighted to be moderating this virtual session on climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction at the 2021 European Forum for Disaster Risk Reduction. And I suppose the first question is, why are we here? What do we hope to achieve? At COP26, the president of COP26, Alok Sharma, said at the event's closing plenary, "Today we can say with credibility that we have kept 1.5 degrees within reach, but its pulse is weak." While efforts to limit global warming may hang by a precarious thread, I don't in any way believe that the pulse of disaster risk reduction is weak. However, in the face of increasingly widespread and severe disasters, with cascading consequences and transboundary implications, especially those involving climate change, there is a large challenge facing us all. Because climate is often the overarching and common link between so many disasters, we just have to look at the recent events in the Europe and Central Asia region. Record-breaking floods, cataclysmic wildfires, heat waves, unseasonable weather that damages resilience further down the line. And now we're heading into a winter with weakened supply chains that have been disrupted by the global COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, adaptation and DRR go hand in hand. Poor adaptation, poor planning, poor responses can create a feedback loop of devastating consequences. Disasters are messy and tragic. On top of the terrible human toll, they degrade the environment and climate even further. Floods leave mountains of hazardous waste behind. Wildfires emit carbon dioxide. Indeed, August 2021 was a record month for global wildfire emissions, with 1.3 gigatons of carbon dioxide released. And sadly, it seems that only the cessation of normal human activity affects climate and the environment in a positive way, as evidenced by data from the various COVID-19 lockdowns. But this is a short-term blip as economies recover, unless we use the opportunity that's been presented to break the cycle of disaster, respond, recover, repeat. So what approaches and tools do we need to identify and understand emerging risks? How can we be as inclusive as possible? And here, I'm not just talking on a community or individual level. I'm also looking at, is there a need for greater coherence in working with sectors that have not traditionally been within the system, actors who aren't sure how the system works, but who have practical and direct and incredibly valuable knowledge of working with solutions? How do we make certain that actions in one area do not create negative, unintended consequences in another? What do the COP26 outcomes mean for DRR in the Europe and Central Asia region? What support is required at local levels? And these are just a few of the areas we hope to explore today. We want to look at the subject in a manner so as to draw out substantive guidance, putting out clear messages of what needs to be done and how. And we need everybody's participation, so the session will unfold as follows. I'm going to introduce the three speakers who will briefly set the scene. Then we have two breakout rooms on the topics of analysis and action. These will be randomly assigned, so don't worry, you just have to join them and it will be explained. Next, the two moderators of the breakout rooms will briefly feed back to the plenary and we'll pick up on some of the questions. I hope we have enough time, but time is always a precious commodity, so my apologies in advance if we can't address all the discussion areas. However, we hope to pick up on questions that have not been addressed at a later date, and for the Google Doc to become a living document that carries on. So let's turn to our introductions. We have Fleur Manasso, who is Senior Technical Expert on Climate Smart DRR, Capacity Strengthening and Partnerships, and she's with the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Centre. We have Taylor Dimsdale, who's Director of E3G's Risk and Resilience Programme in the Washington office, and Piero Pellizzaro, who is Chief Resilience Officer at the City of Milan, who's joining us from the airport on the way to the conference. So we've got a really good balance today. But before we start, let's quickly gauge the mood and confidence of everyone who's participating with a quick poll. The question is, do you think we are adequately prepared for climate change disasters in Europe and Central Asia? The options to select are yes, no, or not sure. So please answer and put your answer in now. sure how the poll's going. So while people are taking the poll, the next round is each of the three speakers is briefly going to set the scene, and I'll ask them to address the question: what do the COP26 outcomes on resilience and adaptation mean for the Europe and Central Asia region? Have we got the results of the poll? Well, I've got to be honest, there's no surprise there. 86% feel that we're not adequately prepared for climate change disasters. I hope that this session and these discussions will go in some way to improving that and at least set us on the right road. So without further ado, I would like to call Fleur Manasso for her brief opening remarks, please.
Thank you so much, Emily. I had trouble unmuting my mic, even though we practiced. Can you hear me?
We can hear you fine.
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. Greetings, everyone, from Amsterdam, the Netherlands. I will reflect on COP26 outcomes briefly and pull in some of the elements that I believe could be relevant for our discussion here today, or for the roadmap for Europe and Central Asia on disaster risk reduction. So the Red Cross has been following all of the COPs over the past 2 decades. And I think this time we saw clearly a different dynamic, with a much higher public pressure upon the leadership and the negotiators. So this COP was not only about ambitions anymore, it was really the leadership who was being pushed to come home with an answer to the question, will we be able to save the planet or not? And quite central to this COP was to keep the long-term goal of the Paris Agreement alive, the 1.5 degrees, as Emily already said. So it was the pressure to not turn this outcome, the outcome of this COP, into a death sentence for small island states. So there was firm language, there was really linguistic power behind it. And in the first week, we witnessed an atmosphere where something is actually possible. So we saw deals between blocks of countries, such as the pledge to stop deforestation by 2030, signed by more than 100 world leaders, with a strong emphasis also on the empowerment of indigenous people to support it, which was quite remarkable. We also saw the pledge to reduce methane emissions, the commitment of a group of countries to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, and the phasing down of coal. So all of this, of course, and here comes my second slide to that, are still words, and that really still needs to go to action, into action. Implementation is yet to be seen, and this is also where part of our concern remains. We are truly hoping that all of these promises will be met, but the reality is, so far, we have seen too many promises not being met. So we're still, for instance, not on track to reach that 1.5 degree warming target, with all the commitments that are listed now in a nationally determined contribution. We have also seen, for instance, the promise of the 100 billion per year not being met, nor the balance of the 50-50 spending on mitigation and adaptation funding is not yet achieved. And we also continue to witness a complete lack of commitments to a financial mechanism for loss and damage, which causes massive discontent. All of these financial issues cause massive discontent, mostly for developing countries, including a lack of trust that they will be supported with the impacts of something that they haven't caused. But now, if we look at the outcome of the COP and link it to the discussion here today, there are quite a few questions for Europe and Central Asia that might be relevant looking forward. So especially in relation to the European record-breaking floods this summer and the fires already mentioned by Emily, are we prepared to deal with more of these types of surprises? Do we believe countries are making necessary connections between adaptation, DRR, and resilience agendas? Do we think that adaptation funding mechanisms, such as the upcoming adaptation mission, which is most relevant for the DRR agenda, but do we think they are well aligned well enough with the DRR needs in Europe and Central Asia, and for instance, with the EU civil protection mechanism? Do we believe that the EU adaptation funding streams are sufficiently geared towards towards reaching those most vulnerable? And do we know well enough who those most vulnerable people are in the climate risk scenarios? So in short, the implementation of practices and concrete action out of policies will be key. And it's important that the Central Asian countries, the EU and the member states, the policies and legislations are really aligned and that they are ambitious. So global commitments alone are not enough. And the Green Deal is key, but coherence, as Emily also mentioned, across policy is crucial for reaching those goals, and cross-sectoral collaboration as well, especially with regards to biodiversity, green resilient COVID recovery, nature-based solutions, and health. So moving to my last slide. From a Red Cross perspective, adaptation finance often does not reach local organizations and local communities. So there's too strong emphasis on technological advances and too little focus on empowering the most vulnerable people to withstand the impacts from climate change. So for instance, heat. It continues to be the most deadliest disaster in Europe. But do we have this fully reflected in our investments? So would that also require more individual awareness of vulnerabilities of those, in need during a heat wave? Am I making sure I'm checking up on my 85-year-old neighbor during a heat wave? So how can we ensure that each of these actions also really trickles down to individuals? We like to see a huge shift in the region's understanding and communication of existing, emerging, and systemic risks, but also increased understanding of climate-induced socioeconomic challenges, compounding and cascading risks, and increasing vulnerabilities. So in the breakout group discussion today on analysis, we will be zooming more on the needs to understand things better, including who are those most vulnerable people, and especially in the context of a just transition that countries will now commit to. Who are they? At COP26, major discussions have again taken place around the issue that those who have caused climate change are not the same as those who suffer the most of the impacts. And I think each European and Central Asian country will also be confronted with this at micro level within their own boundaries. So I think we could benefit from a new social contract on disaster risk and climate change, which articulates citizen engagements, expectations of different government departments, municipalities, private sector, academia, and other actors to set out what disaster risk means for people, their lives, and for their livelihoods. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Fleur. We'll now turn to Taylor Dinsdale, please.
Thank you very much, Emily. And thanks also to Razi and all of the organizers for putting on such a great event and for inviting me to speak today. It's a real pleasure to be with you all. So I'll be very brief. I think Glasgow needed to demonstrate a new and serious commitment to protecting vulnerable populations from climate impacts. It had to do that in response to the code red warning from the IPCC report earlier this year, which showed that the climate damages are much higher above the Paris stretch 1.5 degree target than previously believed. But apart from the science, it also had to respond to the real world and the increasingly severe climate disasters we've seen even just in the few years since the Paris Agreement. So along with consigning coal to history and keeping 1.5 degrees aligned, some of these headline targets, it also had to deliver on resilience. And I think you can come out of COP26 saying that the politics on climate and disaster risk have changed. And I think Fleur has covered a bit of this already very well. And this was maybe the first COP where resilience was really a mainstream issue. So the COP presidency made adaptation and resilience one of its strategic priorities. You had participation and announcements from this whole new ecosystem of initiatives. Too many to mention, but everything from the Global Commission on Adaptation to Race to Resilience to the Adaptation Action Coalition and the Coalition on Climate Resilient Investment and all of the different acronyms that have emerged. And then at the COP itself, there was a day dedicated to adaptation and loss and damage. There was the Resilience Hub at the conference, which I think at one point I saw had over 150 events and almost 200 partner organizations. So I think given that the global conversation on adaptation and resilience has been much less mature than it has been on mitigation, all of that new attention matters and is really a step forward. And then in terms of concrete outcomes, while I think no one could argue that Glasgow delivered the level of resilience and protection that the most vulnerable communities and countries need, it did deliver enough so that there was a consensus to accept the agreement in the end. So I think that was partly due to the collective doubling of adaptation finance pledge by 2025, which goes some way at least towards delivering on a promise made in Paris along the balancing mitigation and adaptation, alongside some of the other funding pledges. I don't know the exact figure, but I think I saw there were just south of 1 billion in new pledges for funds that are broadly aligned with the locally led adaptation principles. There was also the commitment to fully stand up and resource the Santiago expert network, which will provide technical assistance to vulnerable countries on loss and damage. And while the Glasgow Pact didn't provide new funding on loss and damage, you do now have these work plans on formalizing global goal and adaptation and on mobilizing finance for loss and damage. And assurances were given in the sidelines of negotiations that those processes will deliver results and won't just be talk shops. And then finally, and I think this has received a bit less attention, but there's a paragraph in the decision text as well that encourages multilateral financial institutions to consider how climate vulnerability should be reflected in the mobilization of concessional finance, including special drawing rights. And that's where it's sort of this new IMF Resilience and Sustainability Trust Fund, for example, is interesting as a potential vehicle for delivering new resources. So I think there was real progress made, if not enough, of course. In terms of what it means moving forward, I mean, one thing I think it means is that really all countries need to have substantive positions on how we collectively get better at managing climate impacts by COP27. And that's on better assessment, on governance, on funding, and on preparedness. Glasgow essentially said, we recognize this is a problem, we're committing some resources, and we're going to go away and figure out how to do this at scale. So now that has to deliver. And I would say the vulnerable countries essentially gave the rest of the world a lifeline by accepting an agreement that wasn't sufficient, but that has these new forums for discussing solutions. So I think governance is really key, recognizing that this is not just about sort of delivering technical solutions at the local level. This is a systemic risk. So we need to redesign governance in our institutions. And it's easy to lose sight of the sort of fundamental challenge here, which is that the need for humanitarian assistance and disaster response are growing rapidly because of climate change, but we aren't building back better. And that's really not sustainable for vulnerable populations. But I think the good news, just to finish up, is, I think that the EU and the Central Asia region, which with the adaptation strategy, with some of its scientific and technical expertise, is really well placed to lead that global conversation on how you integrate risk and resilience into decision making, because that hasn't happened yet, but COP was a sign of the direction of travel. So I'll stop there and very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Taylor. Cautious optimism, but there's more work to be done. Piero, if we could ask you to now do your brief opening remarks, please.
Yeah, hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's the COP26 was an important moment for the global world to look where we want to stand. We've seen government discussing and negotiating still after 26 years. It's quite a long negotiation without any decision after 26 years. And take me from what I want to say, because at the city level, we don't have time to negotiate, because you cannot negotiate with nature. You cannot negotiate with all the natural events that happened in the city over the last few years. And city were strongly strongly push to get more courage in the decision, because we have faced over the last couple of years one of the biggest pandemic ever seen in cities or as a community. And so city were asking to not postpone important decision, even decision. Sorry for the noise. As said, Emily, I'm in the airport, so I'm flying to I'm reaching the venue. And what is important is somehow is also that we need to understand who wants and who has to pay for what this is transition that is necessary, because there is a topic here. Sustainability of, well, the most developed country contribute significantly to reach the situation where we are. And so I think we also need to consider as a rich country, as most developing country, to get to take the courage. So to start maintaining the agreement reached in Paris, and after all, about the $100 billion dollars investment on climate adaptation and on the transition has to be done. Not tomorrow, has to be done today. So even like to negotiate to get to 80 billion was not what we were expecting. There was more courage in terms of investment. And this one, because all this investment at the end of the day go to city as well as a system to improve the safetyness of our community. On the other end, we also believe that a key role on this perspective should be also understanding where sustainability is not going in the right direction. There is too often example where sustainability has increased inequality among community, especially at the city level. And here is the courage of all different governments to link more equity and climate change transition and energy transition, ecological transition, more strongly, looking at the number, looking at the side effect that also sustainable investment could create. But this I'm saying not because we need to go back, but because we need to move faster. And we need to avoid to have significant consequences that to solve a climate environmental issue, we then go to another problem that is inequality and different among the community. So, and then is where we need to stand as a city, and is where also we then be part of as a resilience hub. We want to share our experience. We want to increase the know-how and exchange of knowledge between citizens and communities, because is where we also create a common demand of action and a common demand of investment and a common demand or a human reaction to what is at the moment is climate change. Climate change is an emergency. As we face the pandemic, we should face climate change at the same level, because there is not any more time to postpone. As Johan Rockström always say, this is the last decade we get to understand where is the planet boundaries, could be sea compliant or not. So thanks a lot, and happy to join the venue soon after this initiative.
Thank you very much. I think that's real dedication doing your speech at the airport. I hope you don't get called halfway through to board. Right, we're now going to move into the breakout rooms, which are on analysis and action. Participants are going to be randomly assigned to a breakout room. And what I would say is you have to then, before you come back into the main plenary in 20 minutes, you have to exit and then rejoin. But I think it will all be made clear by the facilitators. Now, the aim of these rooms is to distill discussions and to understand what the COP26 outcomes on adaptation and resilience mean for the DRR community in our region. And we also hope that these sessions will provide at least one recommendation on how the roadmap 2021-2030 should be taken forward in relation to climate change adaptation and DRR. So if I could ask the facilitators to start placing people in their rooms, and let's start the discussions. Thank you. Well, welcome back, everyone. I hope you've all managed to find your way back after finding your way there. So we allowed a few extra minutes because there was a little bit of kerfuffle about getting into the breakout room. So I apologise for that. What we'd like to do now is to ask the breakout room moderators to give our feedback, drawing out key comments from the group work. I've been looking at the Google Doc, which is brilliant, and there's so many different ideas. But Fleur, if you could give us, from the top of your head, the most important areas that you think came out of that discussion, please.
Thank you so much. It will be difficult to do justice to the discussion. But I think there are a few points that I can highlight here. It was first mentioned that it's extremely complicated to really translate investments to address the real needs on the ground. So even though there's a lot of willingness in the form of grants and loans, it's very hard to identify the best possible investment that needs to be made. And there's so many choices behind it, both politically, but also technically, and it's really difficult to balance the holistic approach that is needed. Then I think the other things that were said around contained, the better use of satellite data, which could be very helpful. And sometimes there might be limitations to it, but very often it can definitely help in the dialogues that are needed with the communities and the governments. So then two massive tools were highlighted here. So that was Voices from the Front Line. Am I saying that correctly? Or it was the Views from the Front Line, sorry. So that was the global network on DRR. Yeah, so that's Views from the Front Line. It's very famous, but it's really the largest global review of risks. And it helps to also for policy makers and practitioners to help guide them what is really needed at local level. And same for Horizon. Of course, this is a huge resource from researchers all around Europe and practitioners. So that will really be action-oriented research that helps that can inform policy and practitioners alike. Then there were other nice ideas about cross-border river collaboration that could be increased to better understand the upstream and downstream needs of communities around the rivers, and that communication is really, really essential. And the last point that was, oh no, it goes on and on. Sorry, I see so much. It still goes on. People are still typing. So I guess there's so many inputs that can be given here, but maybe I should just pause here. And I think, the last one I can mention is that persons with disabilities are often not even mentioned as a specific vulnerable group. So really carve out what are those most vulnerable groups? Do we have them sharp in the face of climate change? Are there differences for different groups in the future, or in the long-term or near-term future around vulnerabilities? So I'll park here for now. Sorry for not doing justice of all the things that have been said.
Thank you, Fleur. I worry that none of us are going to be able to do justice to everything that's been said. We're so limited for time, and it's such a large subject. But we will try our best with the conversation, the questions afterwards. Laurent, could I invite you to give your feedback, please?
Yes, thank you very much, Mehdi. So very fruitful session, even the time was not very, very large, but very good contribution during the session, and also by written our common document. So generally, the angle of methodological approach has been mentioned by Nuno and Dorota, and the need of interpretation and to adapt data to measures by policy makers. This is a very important point to really be sure to assess and evaluate consequences and impact for the population. This was the first approach completed by Elise about the coherence of policies in Europe under the EU strategy and engaging communities, citizens in the climate adaptation risk. I think it's crucial also. A very good remark also regarding the link between prevention, preparedness, and response, to have an approach of cross-sectorial, cross-border approach to be better comprehensive at the European level. We struggle with many known unknowns and unknowns. That has been written also in the common document. So what should be a recommendation is to invest for more methodological assets, means to better better predict natural events and to invest in preparedness for the population and the citizen. That would be my summary of the session. Thank you so much, Emily.
Thank you very much. Very succinct, and it's difficult to sum it all up, isn't it? I mean, I suppose we have a few minutes for questions now, and some of the things that I picked up on the documents, and from jumping not very agilely between the different breakout rooms. One of the comments that I found was very interesting was that it's not easy to find destinations for funds at a local level because they aren't necessarily investment ready. There's a lot tied up with this because there's technicalities and political choices as well, and that sort of comes into the short-termism of politicians. Prevention is never a big seller to people. But how, and I wondered if our panelists and moderators might have any ideas about how to get really community buy-in. Another question was, how do we reach our citizens? How can we really get that? Because I think people are becoming entrenched in their views about climate, and the debate's becoming increasingly toxic. How do we actually engage people within this, including politicians, to understand the issues? I don't know if Fleur, you'd like to kick off with that?
I can try.
Sorry.
I think it's within the Red Cross. We use a participatory tool. It's called the Vulnerability and Capacity Risk Assessment, which enables dialogues with different community groups. It basically provides a set of tools to really understand what local people are, not only what their vulnerabilities are and what they perceive as their biggest risks, but also the capacities that they have to cope with certain events. Usually this vulnerability and capacity assessment, it's very complex. I don't want to make it sound too easy. It's a huge time investment, but it's complex also to translate everything that comes out of such an assessment, triangulate it with secondary data, with scientific data, and then based on that, decide how to, come to priority investments that are needed. And that always happens in dialogue with the same local groups, but also with local government and other stakeholders who can have a stake in it. So it's a complex process. I don't want to make it sound very easy, but it's a big time investment, but that's how we do it at the Red Cross. And especially the local government buy-in is very important, because that makes very often it makes the interventions more sustainable and followed up with subsequent investment from the government entities, hopefully, if it's successful. So I'll leave it here. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Taylor, I wonder if you've got any thoughts on this, because I mean, sometimes if destinations are not investment ready, and obviously, as Fleur has said, the assessments are genuinely complex, how do we sort of get over that? Because this complexity can be a deterrent while making sure that funding is indeed used wisely.
Sure. I mean, clearly it is a big challenge. So there were a few questions in there. So one was, how do you deal with political cycles? Which I think the answer is probably multifaceted. So part of it is that you need to sort of develop the narrative that ties it into what decision makers tend to care about in a shorter term. So while this is at one level a sort of moral issue in terms of providing protection for vulnerable communities that haven't caused the problem, it's also an issue of it's a geopolitical issue. So providing support for countries, for example, that are on the front lines of climate impacts will give them the fiscal space, better debt sustainability, so that they can cooperate on other issues and invest indeed in their own mitigation and adaptation approaches. I think you also need better political economy analysis at the country level of these issues. So this is not just a question of providing you can have the most elegant policy solution or sort of funding investment package, but if there are political challenges or barriers to overcome that you don't understand, those solutions aren't going to go anywhere. So I think in addition to all of the great investment that's been going towards technologies, developing policy frameworks, there also needs to be more investment in political economy analysis so we understand some of these political challenges, for example. And then the last point, I suppose, is just you need to institutionalize some of these frameworks so that they survive some of those political cycles. And again, not something that's easy to do, but there are some reforms that have been proposed that I'd say some countries are beginning to consider that could be models for best practices, more globally. But yeah, very difficult challenges is the short answer, I suppose.
I think so, because I think a lot of, there's a lot of talk about at local level, but it's that citizen engagement that can be really, really difficult when they encounter the processes and the due diligence that, is absolutely vital. But, it's trying to harness that local knowledge and then translate it upwards rather than downwards. I don't know if we still have Piero with us, or has he caught his flight? Laurent, I'm going to pick on you then. What do you think? What do you think about this?
Yes, I think yes, it's not easy for decision makers, for politicals to also give interest to the population. I mean that in many countries, even in Europe, some people are more preoccupied for their daily life, for economic issues, for example, more than climate adaptation risk, and it's very difficult to bring this interest in the population. We even saw that during the pandemic of COVID-19, for example, when you have difficulties to eat every day, so it's not easy to find the right angle for a decision maker to have their citizens and population in the same boat, I would say. So I think it's quite very challenging. So we have to find the good words, the key of comprehension, and to link all these different elements making our lives just to with evidence based that we are in a system, and all system we have subsystems, and that can reach tipping points. So it's very important to identify, to evaluate these tipping points in this system at national, regional, and local level, but even at individual level. I think it's very important.
Absolutely, thank you very much. I mean, one of the things that has come out, obviously, and it was alluded to in the presentations and the discussions, we need to treat climate as an emergency, as COVID-19 was, or still is. It's ongoing. I would like to ask the speakers what they feel has been learnt from the various approaches to trying to deal with the global pandemic that can be translated into preparedness and resilience with regard to climate emergencies and climate change caused emergencies. Taylor, I'll come to you first, please.
Sure. I mean, at one level, it really is just you don't want to say the pandemic has been helpful, but I suppose a silver lining, right, is that there is more recognition of the importance of addressing these systemic risks and of the need to prepare for those kinds of problems. And I think there's been quite a bit that's been written, for example, about tying together the experience between the pandemic with what is increasingly becoming apparent in terms of the risks of climate change. The fact that it's cross-border, there are supply chain questions, it's cross-sectoral, there's no sort of one local solution. No country is an island in this regard. There has to be a level of international cooperation or you won't get to 1.5 degrees, I think is become increasingly clear. So in that sense, part of it is the awareness both of the public and of, I think, high-level decision makers that if you don't address these kinds of systemic risks, these are the consequences. And I think whereas climate previously had been seen as this problem for future generations, I think just in the past few years, right, you've seen both the science improve, you've also seen some of the severity of some of the real world impacts, some additional clarity on that this is not just about the direct impacts, heat waves and floods, it's about these cascading risks across different societies that have development consequences, security consequences, humanitarian consequences. So in that sense, I think it will be helpful in garnering more attention towards climate change.
Thank you very much. Fleur?
Yes, I can only echo that. I think we've witnessed that more than 139 million people over the past 2 years were hit by climate extremes during the COVID pandemic. And that posed all sorts of difficulties and horrific scenarios, I can say. So the discussion, it has triggered more discussion around the need for resilient health systems and the relation it has with disaster risk reduction and resilience. In general, it has more attention to those compounding and cascading risks that Taylor already mentioned. And I think there's a lot of policy space now also to discuss the green and resilient COVID recovery, which I think is very helpful, especially in the context of the disaster risk reduction agenda. So I think there are a couple of important linkages that we need to continue to monitor, and really the push and the willingness, or continue to push for that green resilient COVID recovery.
Thank you very much. Laurent, have you got anything to add to this?
Yes, very quickly, Emily, two points from my side, what we learned about COVID-19. First point will be the collective consciousness and solidarity globally. All the countries in the world, and specifically in Europe, we demonstrate that is the first point, and even at individual level, and how we've been able to adapt some good practices of good mechanism. I would like to take as example the European Civil Protection Mechanism, and we perfectly adapted to repatriate, for example, European citizens, but not only. Then to deliver medical assets like gloves, respirators, and so on, and also to deliver vaccines. So at first, this mechanism was not so for this, but it has been adapted and perfectly play the role we have done it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we are now out of time, so I'm so sorry. We knew it would happen. Even at the beginning of this session, I did say it would happen. But those two documents, the documents from the two sessions, I think are incredible. An incredible resource with all the questions and all the areas that need to be covered. And I guess what came out of this is it's very complicated. One of the things that we didn't get a chance to talk about, which I really wanted to, which was raised, was paying more attention to natural technology risk prevention and how climate change can cause technological disasters and so forth. I think we hope that the roadmap 2021 to 2030 is going to provide a solid basis on which we need to go forward. We know there's a lot more work to do in engagement generally. I think COVID has as practitioners and people who are involved in this, we all knew the benefits of disaster risk reduction. We all live, breathe and eat it. But COVID hopefully has opened the eyes of the world a little bit more to how vulnerable and how fragile the systems are at the end of the day, and how easily they can be derailed. So all I can say is thank you very, very much to our speakers and moderator. This isn't the end of the conversation. This isn't the end of the outcomes and putting together. Let's keep on working on the document, and thank you very much.